now it's time to call upon our next lecturer for today, and that is Mr. Rick Levine from USA, the Master Astrologer, and he's going to discuss quantum astrology, the particle wave duality, and the Earth's uncertainty of fate and free will. I request Mr. Levine to please join us. I like that walk, by the way. I like the way you walk.
Good evening. How about there? All right, this doesn't seem to be working. Oh, there we go. All right, we're good. Thank you. So, one of the problems that we have in astrology is, why do we even bother doing it? And I think people have very different reasons as to why we do astrology, but the fact of the matter is that depending upon how we look at the relationship between fate and free will actually depends upon where we go and what we do with astrology. So we find ourselves often, whether it's in our own lives or in the lives of our clients, we find people facing choices, facing a dilemma. People know what a dilemma is? I bet you don't. Do you know what a lemma is? Because a dilemma is two lemmas. Thought you knew, huh? So a lemma is a statement in a geometric proof. In a Greek, proof, when you do the geometry and you're proving that like two lines are parallel, each statement is a lemma. And when you get to a dilemma, that's a problem because it bifurcates, it goes in two different directions. But the question becomes, how do we even judge whether we're operating under fate or free will? Let's say I'm running to the edge of a cliff and all of a sudden I decide I'm not going to jump. I'm overriding my fate of having jumped to the cliff. But how do I ever know that the program wasn't to have me stop and think that I'm making up my own mind? In a closed system, we can never know. We have to start with a very basic question, and that is, what is reality? I'm going to turn this way so I can't tell whether the thing moves forward or not. So the question is, what is reality? And this is something that scientists philosophers have been looking at for thousands of years. And the real question that began this search, the question really is light or is reality made up of particles, atoms, or is it made up of waves? And the question, is light a particle or a wave, is a basic question that has plagued scientists until the turn of the 20th century, when Albert Einstein, his name has come up a few times already during this conference, showed mathematically that light was packets of energy. They were photons. Light was a particle. The problem, though, is that it can be demonstrated that as light travels, it doesn't travel like bullets, like little tiny microscopic particles. It travels like waves. So the same question can be asked, are electrons particles or waves? And as scientists began developing technologies to look into the microcosm, that's the very small. Cosm, as you probably know, is a Greek word that means order or beauty. And in fact, the microcosm is the tiny order or beauty. The macrocosm is the larger order or beauty. Even our modern word cosmetic, we think means making something beautiful by covering up the ugliness, whereas it really means bringing out the natural beauty. Cosmos and cosmetic have the same origins. So the question is, are electrons particles or waves? And this plagued scientists, and bear with me because this has an absolutely important impact on understanding whether we live in a system where we have fate or free will. So we need to go back a little bit and just talk about the shift of science over the past 100 years or so, because we come from a way of looking at the world that was based upon Isaac Newton's cosmology, where everything was particulate, and the particles could be measured, almost like billiard balls, that there was cause and effect, and that the closer two things were together, the more gravity was exerted on one another, and the farther apart they got, the less influence one had to the other. And that, in fact, linear time was like a clock that went tick, tock, tick, tock. Every second was the same. And that time was an independent variable, meaning that if you did an experiment now, tomorrow morning, next month, at a new moon or a full moon, it wouldn't matter. And the other piece of Newtonian mechanics is that man is separate from nature, not part of nature. But in the 20th century, physics, the hardest core of all hardcore sciences, went belly up. It went vulnerable, soft. And largely, physics was replaced by what we now call the quantum paradigm, where we know that light is a particle, but it travels like a wave. And as soon as we watch the wave, as soon as we look at it, the moment that we look at it, it becomes a particle. We can measure it, we can do the math. But somehow when we stop looking at it, it returns to being a wave. How is this true? Well, we will understand in a few minutes, because it really isn't that complicated. In the quantum paradigm, things don't have locations, they have probabilities. Do you know in 100 years no one has ever seen an electron or any other subatomic particle? What scientists see are clouds of electron possibilities. Another piece of the quantum puzzle is that when things are far apart, they still have direct impact on each other. It doesn't matter how far apart they are, they still have the same impact on one another. And in the quantum paradigm, we have synchronicity, meaning two things that can be separated, but at the same moment in time are connected. And then the final piece of this is that the English author, the American author, Thomas More, calls the re-enchantment of nature. And that is that no longer in this paradigm is man observing nature from a distance, but is part of it again, as he always was in history. Now, the piece of this that becomes important is that a Nobel physics laureate named Werner Heisenberg was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work that has become known as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And this is the key piece of the lecture. We'll come back to it in a few minutes, because what Heisenberg said, he said, well, exactly, the more precisely the position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known in this instant, and vice versa. What this means is that at any given moment, the more you know about where an electron is, the less you know about where it's going. The more you know about where it's going, the less you know about where it is. You cannot know both at once. I want everyone to do a little quick experiment with me. I want you to just sit and lift your right foot off the ground just an inch or two and move it around clockwise in circles, clockwise, and then take your right hand and draw a big 6 in the sky. Just do it. Which direction is your foot going in? The problem is that we cannot know particle and wave at the same time. We cannot know left brain and right brain at the same time. There's a conflict, and we get one or the other, and the more we get about one, the less we get about the other. Now, right now, we have to take a 1.5-minute break, because at this moment, we have a total eclipse of the moon, and we would not be astrologers if we sat in a room isolated from nature without acknowledging that at this moment, actually in 1 minute, the moon will be lined up with the earth and the sun, with the earth casting its shadow on it, and that is happening right now. So I want to stop talking for a moment and just ask you to sit, close your eyes, open your eyes, I don't care, but a quick little meditation. One of the problems that we modern astrologers have is sometimes we forget that there are really planets up there. Okay, back to head stuff. So, we have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that says you can only know one or the other. This is really important. Hold that thought for a moment. Where's my clicker? Okay, so want to take a quick excursion. We could talk about this for a long time. I'm going to do this in about 2 minutes. We know that there's this thing we call the electromagnetic spectrum. These are high frequency waves that are carried in the air, and these waves actually propagate. And in fact, depending upon the frequency, we can see some of these waves. A narrow slit in this spectrum is all the colors that we see. The red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. These colors are frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum. And as we go higher frequency, as we get higher than violet, we go to ultraviolet, and then X-rays and gamma rays. And as we go lower than red, it becomes infra to red. And then we go lower and lower, and we get down to microwaves and radio waves and so on. In most textbooks, you'll see a big question marks at either end of the spectrum. And I'm here to tell you something that is absolutely important to what we do, because, you see, planets actually trace out waves that are contiguous with the electromagnetic spectrum. They're just octaves and octaves lower, so they're very, very, very low frequency. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but the planet waves are not separate from the electromagnetic spectrum. So So the question I want to ask you now is, are planets particles or waves? When we look at an ephemeris and we calculate a chart, we're actually mapping points. Points are particles. When we look up tonight and we see the eclipsed moon, we're looking at the moon as a particle. It is a particle, a huge particle, but it's a particle. When we look at Saturn in the sky and we say that Saturn is at 3 degrees or 4 degrees of Capricorn or in Sag, depending upon what zodiac you use, we're looking at Saturn as a point, as a particle. However, planets are also waves. And in fact, when we're not looking at the moon, it's making a 13 cycle per year wave form. Saturn is making 3 cycles per century. Pluto is making 4 cycles per millennium. These are very, 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 very low frequency waves. So planets are particles and waves. If we look at it, it's a particle, just like a photon, but if we don't look at it, it's a wave. That's the way it works. So, now we're going to come back to the topic, which is fate or free will. And because we can't ever know, I like to encourage my clients to exercise the illusion of free will. We can argue all day long whether something is fate or free will. It doesn't matter on one level. If you actually do things to better yourself, to increase your awareness, to make changes, you're exercising free will, whether it's an illusion or real. And that is what's important. So here we are again, back at this dividing point, except I'm going to suggest that once we understand the quantum nature of things, that it's not fate or free will. It's fate and free will at the same time. However, just like Heisenberg, who said that we couldn't know both particle and wave, we cannot know simultaneously fate and free will. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, again, is the more precisely the position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known in this instant, and vice versa. And I'm going to suggest Levine. That would be me. Levine's uncertainty principle, which says the more precisely fate is determined, the less effective is the free will in this instant, and vice versa. In other words, fate and free will are on a contiguous scale. And there are times in our lives, and there are people who seem to not be able to break out of certain patterns, that there's more fate in operation. And then there are other times when it's either the illusion of free will or free will, when we actually decide what we're going to do it, and everything works out. Now, whether we can exercise free will by meditating, by using gemstones, by chanting, various methods to exercise free will. But in some way, this balance between fate and free will is really the same thing as the balance between particle and wave. I love this. It says, don't worry if you're making waves simply by being yourself. The moon does it all the time. There's a poem that I would like to share written by a poetess who wrote this about 1902, and a very interesting lady. You can Google her, Ella Wheeler Wilcox, and the poem goes like this, and it's called Fate versus Free Will. One ship drives east and another drives west, with the self-same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sails and not the gales that tells us the way to go. Like the winds of sea are the ways of fate as we voyage along through life. 'Tis the set of a soul that decides its goal. and not the calm. Get in context that there are times in our lives when we seem to be able to operate through free will more or less than other times in our lives, and there are people who seem to be able to exhibit more choices in their lives and others who cannot. But again, we're looking at this fate free will thing as a spectrum where you have one or the other. Now, I want to just spend a quick, I'm sorry, that wasn't up when I said the poem, was it? My apologies. I want to spend a quick moment just bringing Albert Einstein back into this equation, because astrology is a paradox. One of the questions we astrologers have had often is astrology a science or an art? And the best description that I've heard of this is that astrology is actually the corpus callosum, that part of the brain that connects the left brain right hand, or the right brain left hand, space and time, yin and yang, masculine and feminine. These energies in some way are separate in the brain, but are connected through this function, this like highway that runs between the two hemispheres of the brain. It used to be thought that space and time were two totally isolated things, kind of like particle and wave. But along comes Albert Einstein and shows us, demonstrates, and then it's experimentally proven that time and space are not separate. This is the paradox, that time and space are interwoven, that the faster you move through space, the slower time gets, until you approach the speed of light when time actually stops. Time and space are not separate. Particle and wave are not separate. Fate and free will are not separate. They are different points on the same spectrum. I'd like to end with another poem, because I think poetry often helps us get out of our intellectual, even though it's words, and into more of a gestalt, into more of a sense of feeling, if you will. And this poem actually addresses the issue of fate and free will, but from a little bit of a different perspective. And it goes like this. The lightning hits, the shift is now. I close my eyes and take the vow to release the future and the past, to focus on the present vast, extending through infinity, extending far as I can see. Whoop, I forgot that again, my apologies. The lightning hits, the sky lights up, the waters pour forth from my cup, the feelings pour forth from my heart, as from the past my life does part. The walls of safety tumble down, my head goes spinning round and round. I'm standing high. There we go. I'm standing high out on a ledge. I leap onto the razor's edge, where form can split and separate. Ambivalence turns to love and hate, where unity is sliced in two, and choice shows us what we must do. Where issues are forced, so we must choose something to gain, something to lose, something feared, something desired. The pressure to choose makes me grow tired. Something I want, something I fear. Excitement mounts. The moment grows near. Time speeds up and my heart beats fast. I fear this moment will not last, but then I remember the razor's edge and the illusion of feeling like I'm on that ledge. You see, the moment of now is all that exists. Create past and future, then something resists events in the future that hurt long ago, creating rough water in time's river flow. For time is a river that flows to the sea, The storm waves dissolve when we just let it be. When the past and the future are locked in desire, the rapids build and the waves grow higher, but it's all in the mind. For the ledge is unreal. It's the fear of the fall that's the fate that we seal. You see, the razor is safe if we stay here and now. So I soften my vision and repeat my old vow. I release unborn futures, letting go of the past, and the infinite present grows cosmically fast. Think cosmically, but act locally. Thank you all. And since my bell has not been rung, again, there's an eclipse going on. And this eclipse is interesting to me for a number of reasons, but I find it interesting because during this eclipse that Uranus is exactly square the midpoint between Mercury and Pluto. And you can see I've put in a little black arrow. The halfway point between Mercury and Pluto is 24 degrees Capricorn, which is square. Oh, thank you. It's just like, I'm looking at, never mind. Thank you. So here, the arrow, thank you for that. The arrow, which is showing the midpoint between Mercury and Pluto, is exactly at 24 degrees of Capricorn, which is square to Uranus. And so this eclipse has this electric buzz that from the Mercury-Uranus square a few days ago is still being carried over right now. And I find it interesting that within a few minutes, Mercury will actually move from Capricorn into Aquarius. And I understand that we have differing zodiacs here, so forgive me in my Western folly. And incidentally, just a quick word on my perception on the difference of the two zodiacs. One is based on time and one is based on space. That when you're using the sidereal zodiac, we're talking about Einstein's time and space are related, that the spatial construct is based upon the stars in the sky. The temporal or time aspect is based upon the actual seasons here on Earth. Time and space are connected. You can't get both. You have to look at one or the other, just like particle and wave and just like fate and free will. This is the uncertainty principle. Thank you all for your indulgence. It's an honor to be here.